Good day and welcome to our 6th week of Retreat in Daily Life as we beg the Lord for the grace of being interiorly one with Him as we go through the season of Lent and as we breach that season and slowly enter the Holy Week through the Passion Sunday. For this week, I'd like to propose this grace that we can beg for. We can beg Jesus for the grace to be with Him interiorly, to deepen our gratitude and sorrow for what Christ willingly suffers for us. Consciously, we can elect to be present as witnesses, as the heart and love of God, giving God's self for our sake. And so, as I have mentioned, this week starts with Passion Sunday, and we can enter this season, mga mahal na araw, as we Filipinos endearingly call it. We are invited to keep track of the context of our journey with Christ and enter the solemn moment of the heart of our faith. But we would want to affirm our interior disposition of intensified begging and reverence. We can try to be present with our whole being to fully receive and render our humble presence, to be there, but in our simplicity and poverty, humbly receiving fullness of life in the events of the Holy Week. We'd like to linger a bit with that disposition of poverty and humility in this coming week. We are not the center of attention as we join interiorly with Jesus. We are invited to fully be present with Him and be interiorly one with Him in compassion, in sorrow, in the reality of the poverty and humility that He is going through, and the depth of His love that He is giving. We are asked to be present as witnesses, but more so as receivers of this fullness of grace that will happen this week. And so our Lord welcomes the pain, the suffering that we have gone through, but instead of focusing on what we ourselves have gone through, we look intently at Jesus, and if He so invites us to bring before Him the things that we have suffered through, then that may happen. But in our humility, we would want to let go of any temptation to put in our own reality ahead of the reality of the unfolding passion of the Lord. And so we are not there to help Jesus throughout His suffering as He suffers for us. We are not there to call attention to ourselves as the Lord goes through His suffering for us. And we are not there to pabida, or to be the center of attention. Whatever depth of pain and suffering we may have gone through that is dignified and perhaps praiseworthy, all of these can never measure up to the reality of what Jesus has gone through. And not only because of the intensity of what He has suffered through, but more so because of the love and the outpouring of grace that He accomplishes as He goes through His passion, death, and resurrection. And so our invitation is to hold on to that interior disposition of poverty and humility before the Lord. Keep our attention to that unyielding, unconditional love of God for us as He gives of Himself beyond our understanding, and hence, along with our poverty and humility, along with intensified begging, along with our reverence sometimes, or part of it really is the confusion before the depth of love, the reality of this mystery that will always be beyond our reckoning, beyond our comprehension, that is always beyond us, and hence we would like to beg the Lord to be one with Him interiorly so that He can guide us to their meaning, their implications, and even the depth of lingering with them in His company. So even as God endures suffering, we get a glimpse of His divinity in human suffering. God saves us through the humanity of Jesus, and we are to remember we are beggars this week. Our simplest, perhaps the nakedness of our being there, present, that is allowed by God to approach His mystery of love. All of these are invitations for us to return to the rawness of the Passion Week. If we are to linger a bit in this reality of the shock and the rawness of the days of the Passion of the Lord, you may want to, again, go back to our Christian ancestors, the apostolic witness about it. In the history of Christian art, the first representations of the crucified Lord came up around 400 or 499 Anno Domini, AD. It was very difficult for the first Christians to depict the Lord in His suffering. The crucified Lord in Christian art was preceded by artistic representations of the Good Shepherd, or even the ictus, the symbol of the fish, because for the first Christians, for the apostolic witnesses, the experience of the crucifixion was very shocking, was very, very raw, very incomprehensible. And so for the first 500 years, even embracing the Council of Nicaea, they had difficulty representing Jesus as crucified, because there's this shocking or trembling element in the reality of the horror of the cross. Okay, so we are invited perhaps to go back to that. How did it felt like for the apostles as they entered the Passion Week? How come they were all scattered? They ran for their lives, and somehow even the first 500 years of our faith, it was very difficult for them to look back at what happened during the Passion Week. If you go back to the Gospels were written around 33 to 100 AD. The fully developed part of the Gospels are always the Passion narratives. So in words, they could recall what has happened, but artistically, graphically, in terms of representations that are images, it was difficult for the first Christians to go back to it. And so we would want to perhaps approximate that disposition of trembling and really being one with Christ, so that it will not only be our own comprehensions that we will be relying on, it will be more of the guidance of the Lord as we beg Him for the grace to be with Him interiorly. Perhaps to help us understand this disposition of poverty and humility, some figures would be helpful for us, like the figure of Bartimaeus in Mark 10, helpful and very significant for us as he, throw away his cloak, the symbol of his livelihood, to be more available to the poverty that was his call in following Jesus. There's this small details in Mark 10 in the calling of Bartimaeus that would easily escape us. But, the setting away of his cloak means for him, his days of relying on alms is over. But another version of poverty was available to him, and that version of poverty is that of following Jesus along the way. And we know that Jesus was then on his way to Jerusalem, to his passion, death, and resurrection, and the beggar Bartimaeus was able to follow him, no longer as a beggar for alms of people who pass by, but a beggar for the salvation that is made available for him by the passion, death, and resurrection of the Lord. And so we would want to emulate or go by the example of Bartimaeus as he followed Jesus along the way, allow Jesus to shepherd him, allow the Lord to enable him to understand that, a new version of poverty, being a beggar, is that of, standing before the cross in all its horrors and being available, being present, so that we can receive humbly, we can receive fully in all our reality as a human being, the outpouring of graces that has happened in the cross. And perhaps as a contrast to this figure of Bartimaeus, we can consider the figure of Thomas the Apostle. And we are familiar with the story of Thomas, the twin, who is usually called the doubter in some stories or some accounts. But if we go back to John 11, verse 16, we hear not of a wavering apostle, but we hear of an apostle who is sure of his conviction of readiness to die for his Lord, readiness to stand with Jesus, walk with him, even to die with him. And yet again, the cross and the horror of Jesus' dying, the Lord's death on the cross, has really shaken him in that he was so ready to die for Jesus, but it was Jesus who died for him. And someone who with full conviction to die for somebody else, and that somebody in his love and compassion took away that that position of being the martyr or the savior, but took on to him, that dying, that death, that pain, that suffering, so much that this replacement of a fully convinced, fully decided person like Thomas, that replacement by his Lord has really shook him to his core, so much so that even if he's hearing his fellow apostles witnessing to the Lord's resurrection, he could not, he could not really accept it. He could not really understand it because it was a position of poverty. It was a position of humility. There's nobility perhaps in someone's being courageous in the reality of dying for somebody else. And yet there's a deeper love, but that love somehow demands a reception. And that receiving was a difficult invitation for Thomas the Apostle. And so it took the very person of the resurrected Jesus before him to really awaken him to that reality, to really usher him into that poverty and humility, to accept, what the passion in its salvific value is offering to Thomas the Apostle. And so Bartimaeus, as contrast with someone like Apostle Thomas, would again highlight, this invitation of intensified begging or intensified humility before the cross. And of course, the last figure we may want to consider as we usher ourselves into this Holy Week, as we introduce the themes of the Passion Week, we are invited to be one with, the poverty of Jesus himself. In the Gospel of St. Matthew, verse 25, the Lord has said, whatever you do to the least of my brothers, you do it to me. But in the Gospel according to St. John, in chapter 12, there's this identification between Jesus and the poor, as Jesus allows Mary of Bethany to anoint him and prepare him for his Passion days. Somehow, commentators of the scriptures are telling us somehow Jesus then was really embracing that deep identification between him and the poor, that he has come to this loneliness, that he has come to this abject poverty, that, in his particularity as Jesus and Lord, he's ready to receive the anointing given him by Mary of Bethany. And so if you go to the classic Paulinian canticle on his letter to the Philippians, chapter 2, of course, this humility of Jesus, humility of God made man is thoroughly highlighted, and the invitation there is to put on this interiority of Christ, put on this mind and heart of Christ. And we would want to, hold on to that invitation of St. Paul as we enter this week of grace of the Passion events. And last point to consider as we dwell or linger with our dispositions of poverty and humility is the scene of John 19, verse 26 to 27, when Jesus entrusted the Blessed Mother to the beloved disciple. Again, this is the depth of the poverty of Jesus as he goes through the passion of the cross. I came across this reflection given by Chiara Lubick. She's the foundress of the Focolare movement, and she has this reflection about Jesus entrusting his mother to the beloved disciple. And in passing, she just mentioned, one of our foundational uh, existential certitudes or foundational realities that gives us confidence is that reality of having a mother. And that is understandable, especially for us Filipinos. When your mother is around, even if you are separated by a great distance, you know that your mother will always be there to welcome you. A home is really a place where we stop crying because we know that our parents, especially our mothers, are always there to embrace us, welcome us, and allow us to cry until our weeping will run its course. But according to Kiara, this poverty of Jesus was so embraced by him in that scene of he entrusted this mother who is a source of a reliable confidence, a reliable home for him. He entrusted Mary, his mother, to somebody else, to the beloved disciple. Meaning, of course, he was willing to let go even of this, greatest of human home or human sureness or certainty, and fully embrace that absoluteness of depending totally on his Father, who is God. And of course, that giving has given us a mother for our church, for our faith. But according to Kiara, that is the depth of the poverty that Jesus has embraced. And as we go back to what we are saying, this disposition that we are to intensify our begging and enter the mahal na araw, these dearly beloved days, with total humility, receptivity, and openness to the grace and the guidance of Jesus. So much so that he will allow us to be interiorly one with him, and somehow experience also shame and sorrow as we consider our sins, because all of this Jesus is going through for our sake. And so we may want to linger with that disposition and even consider some prayer points that would allow you to enter into that poverty. Consider Bartimaeus, consider his contrast, the Apostle St. Thomas, and consider the poverty of Jesus in Philippians and John 19, so that you will be properly disposed and properly prepared for this most holy day.
This is a good place to pause and to consider the following questions. How comfortable am I in being called to poverty and humility, in being a beggar before the mercy of Jesus? How close am I to the reality of Thomas the Apostle? Am I doing the work for God instead of being an instrument who humbly follows God's work? How am I invited to be in the heart of communion with Him these days of Jesus' self-giving? What can we learn from Mary as she witnessed to the poverty of the God-made man? Gaano kakomportable ako sa tawag na maging dukha at mapakumbaba sa harap ng habag ng Diyos? Gaano kalapit ako sa halimbawa ni Tomas na apostol? Ako ba ay kakumpetensya ng Diyos sa kanyang trabaho? O kaya kong maging tunay na instrumento, mapakumbabang sumusunod sa kanyang gawa? Nadarama ko ba ang paanyayang pumasok ng malalim sa buod ng komunyon sa pagbibigay sarili ni Jesus? Ano ang matututunan ko sa Inang Maria sa kanyang pagsasaksi sa pagkatukha ng Diyos na nagkatawang tao?
The Passion narratives are usually long, and if you hear Mass this Sunday, then you will hear a very lengthy account of the trial before Pilate. No, we will start with the Blessed Eucharist and its foundation, and then the trial of Pilate, and then the trial in and then after the trial, the Passion narratives, the giving of himself in a cross would be narrated. And I'd like to highlight a detail that will come up on Good Friday. That is in the reading of the Passion account of John 19. In John 19, there's this very passing detail that would perhaps go unnoticed if we do not give time to, prayerfully reading the Passion account in John 19. And I'd like to highlight that the seating of Jesus on the judgment seat, after he was flogged by Pilate. This is the scene of, the Ecce Homo, the presenting of Jesus to the crowd, to the people, after he was crowned with thorns, after he was flogged at the pillar, and he was seated at this judgment seat, and before him lay or standing were people who were shouting out to Pilate that he be crucified. It's a very, very moving scene of judgment. And if we look through this theme of judgment in the Gospel according to St. John, the context of sitting on the judgment seat, there are previous chapters that would give out some details regarding judgment and somehow built up to that point of sitting Jesus on the judgment seat before people who were crying out that he be crucified. In John 5, for example, for just as the Father raises the dead and gives life, so also the Son of Man will do. Nor does the Father judge anyone, but he has given all judgment to the Son. He has given all judgment to the Son, so that all may honor the Son as they honor the Father. Here we hear, Jesus being entrusted with the judgment of all reality, of all humanity, the judgment of the world. And here we hear of the Father presenting Jesus to us as our judge. There are echoes of Old Testament relations between a master and his shalayak, his representative, happening here. If you want to go back to Genesis 24, when Abraham was looking for a bride for Isaac, he sent his Shalayak, his representative, his steward, who is an entrusted servant, to look for a fitting bride or a fitting spouse for Isaac. And right after Eleazar was called, he acted already in the name of Abraham in that Old Testament chapter in Genesis 24. He just freely went through the property of Abraham, bringing with him treasures and even animals that would be helpful for him in looking for a bride for the son of Abraham, Isaac. And this Shalayak, Eliezer, was really deciding and judging in the name of the master who has sent him. So when he was contracting or relating with people, especially potential brides for Isaac, when he was negotiating or talking to the parents of Rebecca, or the parents of the wife of potential wife of Isaac, he was acting and judging in the name of Abraham. He was so trusted to do that, and somehow the giving of the judgment to the son carries this echo coming from the Old Testament. Of course, Jesus is more than a Shalayak, is more than a trusted servant. And of course, there are, echoes of Jesus being the suffering servant, and yet as the son, he is more than a representative because he claims to be one with the Father. In John 8, okay, we hear this. Jesus tells the Pharisees, "You, Pharisees, judge by appearances, but I do not judge anyone. Even if I should judge, my judgment is valid, because I am not alone, but it is I and the Father who sent me." And so there's this closeness, this oneness between Jesus and the Father, in that his judgment is not made on his own, but it is a judgment that is one with the Father. It is a judgment in which the Father is present in him. And so here, we are also surprised because the Lord says, "You, Pharisees, judge by appearances, but I do not judge anyone." And this is somehow the word explanation that will allow us to understand what is happening in the sitting on that judgment seat or Gabata in John 19:13. When Jesus was seated on the judgment seat, if we are alert to what he has said in John 8, I do not judge anyone. And in other parts of John 8, there's a dramatic portrayal of that non-judgment clarified as non-condemnation coming from Jesus, who is one with the Father. In John 8, verse 11, before the woman who was caught in adultery, clearly the Lord, in that scene, was meeting someone who could not defend herself. The Lord was before someone who can no longer explain herself and her status before anyone, especially the Lord. The Pharisees and the scribes made sure that there won't be any defense available for this woman. And yet, when the sinner was before Jesus, that stance of non-condemnation, that stance of non-judgment was afforded to her, was given her. So much so that the Lord even said, those who have no sin be the first to throw stones at her. So again, the depth of the oneness with the Lord, our embrace of our poverty and humility leads us to wonder and awe before someone who does not condemn sinners, before someone who, according to the writing of St. Paul in Romans, this Jesus is the love of God proven to us, because while we were sinners, he already offered himself. And while we were sinners, he died on the cross for us. This is the depth of God's love for us, that depth of he took on death for himself so that we may have life. He was made sin for our sakes, so that sinners like us will not be condemned. He embraced the cross for us so that those who are needing of his mercy, those who are needing of his forgiveness, would have access to the mercy and compassion of the Father. So we are to we are invited to look at the depth of Jesus' compassion, the depth of Jesus' love, mindful of the depth of our need for him in our sinfulness, in our brokenness, and see in his eyes, the eyes of someone who does not condemn, someone who gives us that possibility of change, that space for growth in the unconditionality or in the hospitality of this large space of his mercy, of his compassion. For all our attempts to change ourselves, for all our realities of wanting to improve on ourselves, we always fail because there's this reality of brokenness that is so deep in who we are that it can only be a space that is opened up in surrender. Can only be a space that is open up to receive this love and compassion coming from God.
Let's pause here just to allow us to further reflect on the preceding points on receiving God's justice as mercy. How do I receive God's assurance of unconditional love and mercy like He did with the woman caught in adultery? That is, neither do I condemn you. Sandaling tumigil tayo dito upang pagnilayan pa ang katatapos na puntos ukol sa pagtanggap natin ng katarungan ng Diyos bilang habag. Paano ko tinatanggap ang paanyaya ng Diyos sa kanyang pag-ibig at habag na walang pasubali, gaya ng naging tugon niya sa babaeng na huling nakikiapid, maging ako'y hindi ka kinokondena.
Now, here we are to avoid perhaps some traps or some waywardness. Okay, as we are trying to say, whenever we encounter this Jesus who is seated on the Gabbatha, whose judgment towards us is the judgment of compassion and forgiveness and non-condemnation. The only way for us to respond to that is to surrender and to benefit Jackson. We will never be able to prove ourselves or improve on ourselves on our own. So much so that we can never measure up to a degree of worthiness or a degree of qualification that would allow us to be a fitting recipient of that grace of forgiveness and that salvation coming from Jesus. No, we at this point, perhaps we are to really go back to the disposition that we have lingered with in the opening of this reflection. Before the judgment of compassion and mercy, there's this simplicity in the embrace of poverty. There's this simplicity in simply opening ourselves up and receiving God's grace. So the waywardness would be trying to prove ourselves to be worthy for this grace of salvation and forgiveness. Another waywardness is, the failure to surrender to this grace of salvation and forgiveness. Non-surrender would mean somehow this measure of love that is overflowing beyond understanding would always hover around us if unaccepted, and come across as an expectation or a demand. And again, this dynamic of trying to improve the self or trying to make up the self, and even somehow escaping or moving away from God because of that failure to create the self somehow after that image of the demand would crumble and never be doable for us. And so another version of the waywardness would be that frustrated self-righteousness or that frustrated moral elitism that would simply be a version of self-excuse. And again, it it is rooted in that non-acceptance or failure to surrender to God's mercy and compassion. Here at the Gabada seat, if you want to refer to the writings of John Paul II in Dives in Misericordia, you may want to read through that encyclical and get to your surprise at this point of, recognizing God's justice as His mercy, recognizing the righteousness of God as His compassion for us, as His pulling out something good from the wretchedness and the poverty of the human reality. A friend of mine who read through Dives in Misericordia simply said, after considering God's compassion and mercy, you simply get to a point that the real decision for the human person is the embrace of humility and poverty, that there's nothing else that is demanded of the human person other than to surrender to God's forgiveness and love. And perhaps there are so many variations of waywardness regarding this, because that would mean an embrace of death for ourselves. It's not only self-abasement, it's not only the humbling of the self, but really, a place of surrender, a place of deep faith, a place of Christian hope. People who have gone through grieving, people who have gone through transitions, people who have gone through difficult experiences in their lives are able to see themselves in this situation of surrender, situation of simply entrusting ourselves to God's mercy and compassion. That for all the life that is in us, for all our desire to improve ourselves and to be better at being ourselves, there will come a point when we simply will have to entrust ourselves to someone who is greater than us. And that parallels this embrace of true faith as that point of dying to the self. I remember in the writings of John Chichester, she said, the Sunday after we buried our mother, she said, at the recitation of Credo during Sunday Mass, Joan Chichester said, I was so shaken up that I had to really pull out my inner resources to be able to say, I believe in the resurrection of the dead. And that is the dying that we are saying here. That is the surrender that we are saying here. The horror of the cross, the judgment of God as mercy, would really escape our human understanding. Our human intellect will never be able to understand fully what that means. And hence that's this only option of humility and poverty, that we are to accept this. We are to surrender to this. We are to make this as the foundation of who we are and what we are called to. Now, again, perhaps this may be a good time to stop and reflect on that judgment seat and the mentioned context in John 5 and John 8, and its parallel in John 8, the woman caught in adultery, but also it's parallel in Luke 23 verse 34 when Jesus and the eyes of Peter met after the denial of Peter, that he even knew Jesus. What was in that eye of someone without judgment but all love was offering all of this as salvation. What is in the eye of this someone who was looking out, at the reality of people shouting, "Crucify him," and seated on that judgment seat without condemnation. Okay? The last point we would want to consider is enshrined in the second letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians. Here, in the 5th chapter and verse 19, we hear the Father was in Jesus reconciling the world to himself. Jesus sitting on Gabbatha, the judgment seat, Jesus dying on the cross and saying, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." This Jesus who gave away his mother so that we can gain a mother in our faith. And this Jesus is who is holding on to, okay, that salvation coming from the Father would somehow look very lonely as he hangs upon the cross for us. And yet interiorly, we can beg the Lord to show us how the Father has not abandoned me. I am never alone. The Father is with me. And we would want to beg the Lord for that experience of not only lovingly going through suffering for our sake, but also, that depth of communion between the Father and Jesus in this suffering for our salvation. In John 8, verse 29, clearly Jesus says, "The one who sent me is with me. He has not left me alone." And so even in that summit of his outpouring of his love and salvation for us, the Father abides by Jesus. Even in his silence, he was one with the Son, reconciling the world with himself. Perhaps, we can linger a bit and say, okay, in the suffering of the Son, the Father was there, listening, totally one with his Son, reconciling the world to himself. As he listens and gives space to this passion that is the salvation of the world. The third point we'd like to consider is the cross of Christ as the wellspring of Christian hope. Again, we would want to gather threads that we have said before, that we would want to be led into this communion with Jesus in his salvific suffering for us. We would want to, in our poverty, as beneficiaries, as receivers of His grace, compassion, and salvation, we would want to or desire to commune with Him as He pours Himself out for us and be the wellspring of Christian hope that would help us as His followers, as His disciples. And here we would want to suggest, the crucifixion of Christ may come across as a very horrific, a very terrifying, and perhaps even a very lonely reality, as if Jesus was there, abandoned. And yet, in the previous point that we have considered, clearly in John 8, verse 29, Jesus says, "The one who sent me is with me. He has not left me alone. He has not," and Jesus here is talking about the Father. "He has not abandoned me." And in this judgment of mercy towards humanity, that Jesus' response towards sinners, that is non-condemnation, is a judgment that is one with the mercy and compassion of the Father. And if we look back even in the Old Testament, in Wisdom chapter 15, verse 2, we hear God saying, even if we sin, even if humanity sin, they are still owned by God. And that again, that oneness between Jesus and the Father flowing out to mercy towards us, flowing out as forgiveness towards us, baffles us, confuses us, that we remain to be beloved, precious for God, even while we fall into sin. That's why He never fails to call on us to go back to Him. He never fails to invite us to benefit from this forgiveness, from His mercy. So much so that in Psalm 89, verse 32 and 34, if the children of David sins, even if human beings sin, they may have to suffer through the implications or the results of their sinfulness. And yet the Lord assures the sons of David, and the Lord assures us, "I will never take away my love." And so as we consider the crucified Jesus accomplishing salvation for all of humanity, for all of the world, interiorly, perhaps we can beg Jesus to allow us also a glimpse of how the Father is one with Him as He reconciles the world to Himself. And that is enshrined in 2 Corinthians chapter 5:19, that it's not as if the Father left Jesus while He was undergoing that depth of passion for us, but it's all the more an expression of a deeper communion, perhaps not easily seen, a deeper oneness, perhaps that is difficult to look at. A quiet, a listening, availability, or presence at that very moment of the outpouring of salvation for us. Um, this is important in giving shape to um, Christian love, Christian hope, Christian faith. Our hope is more than just positive thinking or looking at the bright side or optimism. Our hope is more than just a reliance on power, although that power may well be God, who is almighty in himself. But the source of Christian hope for us is this fidelity between Jesus and his Father, and this fidelity flowing out towards us, inviting us to live in hope, although reality may be bleak and dark. And that hope is not a hope that is a disattachment or an abstraction or a moving away from the particularities of our human reality. No, that hope is precisely an invitation to abide by or to remain in the very details of who we are, our relationships, and the particularities of people we deal with and our situation. Our hope is never a pie in the sky that would simply just give us false consolation out of the dirtiness or the soil or the mud of poverty and difficulty. No, this Christian hope is a hope that is also a call to fidelity. It's not just the presence of magnificent churches amidst the urban poor, but it is the call of all the baptized to be one with, to be faithful to journey with people who are near to them, people around them, people they know by name. And so Christian hope, as we benefit from the salvation coming from Jesus, would not pull us out of the very situation we are immersed in. Christian hope takes on, our problems with voters' education, our problems with the nature of leaders that we have right now, our problems with, the agrarian reform and the anti-dynasty laws not being given proper legislation or proper incarnation or proper reality in laws that would be defined for the land. Our salvation takes on the very reality of indigenous people in the country who until now suffer being dismissed, being marginalized, or not being seen. Perhaps even the difficult realities we would rather not admit to each other, or the difficult shadows that our communion, our church may have right now. These are all included, all embraced by the Christian hope that is rooted in the fidelity between Jesus and the Father, in the reality of Jesus dying on the cross for us. So it matters that love and fidelity are there in the very heart of Jesus' revelation of his love and salvation for us, in the very heart of Jesus' revelation of who God is for us. It matters that God is not only almighty and powerful, but God is all-loving and faithful even to sinners, broken, fallen men and women like ourselves. And this will allow us to hold on to the person of Jesus, even at that very point when perhaps we are pushed to despair or surrender. Real Christian hope is always at the brink of desperation and surrender to the darkness that would enslave us. But genuine Christian hope is a prayer of surrender to Jesus, who may be difficult for us to picture and yet abides by us even at that very depth of being humbled, being needy, being rejected, being misunderstood. Again, as we go back to these days we call Mahal na Araw, we approach the cross of Jesus, trying to enter into the very heart of what is happening with all humility, with all simplicity, so much so that it will lead us to a better experience, not only understanding, but a better heart that feels with Him, that abides by Him, that sometimes even at the confusion of our minds, that heart would help us to be reminded that the invitation is to love Jesus not only with our intelligence, but to love Jesus with a trust that sometimes is challenged by the darkness or the difficulty we are in. But even then, to hold on to the Lord, as in His graciousness, He allows us to, experience His face, experience His love, experience His compassion and His presence in a very difficult reality like that of the cross. So, to each one of us, the passion mystery would play out differently, but always, the guidance of the interiority of Jesus, although it may call us to the very depth of humility and poverty as death or dying to self, it's really the moment of faith, rejoicing, the moment of hope that is not just a conviction or a positive thinking or optimism, but a hope that is so immersed in this fidelity that God has for us, a hope that is strengthened by that very personal salvation that God accomplishes in our life.
Let's pause once more at this point and ask ourselves, when we linger on this truth about pinning our hope of God's fidelity in loving us to the end as the very source of Christian hope, even in the midst of darkness and difficulty, how do I find my heart responding? Muli, tumigil tayo sandali at tanungin ang ating sarili. Kapag ninanamnam natin ang katotohanan tungkol sa pagyakap ng pag-asa sa katapatan ng Diyos na nagmamahal sa atin hanggang sa wakas, paano tumutugon ang ating puso?
And so we hope these days of the retreat in daily life are helpful for you as you deepen your friendship with the Lord and as you look into the very details of where you are and the very realities where Jesus is saving you. We hope that the presence, the abiding salvation, the abiding reality and friendship with Jesus was deepened. I hope that you are accompanied by the Lord in these days. Thank you.
Saan kami tutungo, kaming makasalanan? Saan kami susulong, dahas laging kapisan? Ikaw, Jesus, ang susundan, ikaw poon ang hantungan. Sino kayang uusig sa di makatarungan? Sino kayang lulupig sa kim na umiiral? Sa sino mang sa Diyos mulat, katarungan magbubuhat. Kaloob mong talino, atas mo'y pagyamanin, sa pakikihamok lagi nating gamitin. Karahas ay pipilitin, kamali ay tutuwirin.